I do not think that bombing Iran is the beginning of World War III.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. It is only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this program is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate and actual performance may differ. As always, please remember investing involves risk.
And we are back with another edition of the Daily Dots. Thank you for joining us. And I am not joined, as always, by the brain trust himself, Mr. Chase Taylor. I'm trying to remember why he had to go. I think he was dealing with a car issue. I think that's what it was. Anyway, so he couldn't be here today. But that's okay. Plenty of stuff to discuss, obviously, with what's, gone on along the weekends and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, there's not nearly as much to discuss as I think people would have thought. I think things have played out much like we sort of thought they would, meaning, I was just on another podcast and we started off laughing because, the woman who runs the podcast, really popular podcast, especially in this area where I live. She was telling me last week, she was saying, cause I'm on there once a week. And she was saying last week, Zach, you said, watch, everybody over the weekend is going to become an expert on the Strait of Hormuz. And she goes, boy, was that right? She goes, all of a sudden, everybody's talking about it. And I go, oh, yeah. And you've heard this headlines. Oh, they're shutting the Strait of Hormuz. Da, da, da. And look, when you're dealing with a regime like the Iranian regime and the Ayatollah, you can't X anything out. The reason that I thought all of that, and for that matter, Chase too, thought all that was overbaked is, if you looked at closing the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll get into the market, but I'm sure that you guys have all heard these hot takes, so I just kind of wanted to address this right out of the gate. The reason we didn't think that they'd follow through is that when you looked at what they were doing, I didn't see that helping them at all. The only benefit that could potentially give them or any of their oil producing brethren is a higher cost. The problem is it's going to trap so much that oil, so they're not going to realize that cost. More importantly, and here's the other thing to remember. I misstated it a little bit. Well, I mean, I could have been right. I said if you close the Strait of Hormuz, you'd see a pretty good premium get bid into oil. And I think I said, over 100, 120, something like that. Talking with Chase and looking at some other guys' numbers, I think you probably could have driven oil substantially higher than that. And just wanted to relay what I was saying. People go, well, Zach, yeah, but the Strait of Hormuz, only 20% of global oil goes through there anymore. It's not nearly as important as it was 40 years ago. 100% true. Okay, but what people don't understand about the oil market is a 20% drop in, so for instance, let's say they cut the Strait of Hormuz and global oil production, right, was dropped 20% instantly. Okay. It's going to correlate to a much higher jump in the price of oil than 20%. And why is that? Because if you need oil, you can't push off your purchase. If your car is out of gas, you're not getting home unless you fill up. You can't sit there and say the price of oil is too high, I'm not turning on my lights, right? So, if you're a trucking company, you can't say, hey, well, things are going to go undelivered because we don't have diesel. If diesel doubles in price, you're going to pass that on to the end consumer and you're going to buy the diesel, right? So that's why the movements in, I think that's why the price movements in oil catch so many people off guard based off, the underlying swing in the economy. They're like, well, what do you mean? You barely even hit oil demand. Why would that affect the price so much? Because it's determined at the margin. And here's why. Oil has a value, right? If I produce a bunch of oil, and this is what happened back in COVID, and I've got nowhere to sell it, there's a cost to store that, right? There's a cumbersome process I have to go in to preserve that asset. I got to barrel it. I've got to store it somewhere. And there's a cost. And so that's why we always say that oil is something that the price of oil is determined on the margin. And like I said, there's a lot of I think you'd say most use cases for oil. It's, what happens to oil demand if the price of oil goes to 130? Well, recently what we've seen is oil demand doesn't really change much, right? So it has an inelastic price action activity to it. And the reason why is because, again, if you need oil, that need is not elastic. It doesn't change. You can't sit there and go, no, we're going to give it 2 weeks, right? You need it now. And, and we learned a lot of those dynamics through COVID, right? Which is people are like, how could oil possibly go for negative? Well, because what you're doing is you're counting in the cost to store it. Right? Somebody has to take delivery of it, and it's got to be stored somewhere. It's got to get shipped somewhere. And right, it can't just sit there. Or, you can't just start pouring it out on the ground. And the inverse is true. And a really good way to understand this in meaning. Now, there were some other dynamics in play here. There always are, but this kind of gives you a good stencil. Go back and look at the great financial crisis from 07 to 09. I think in 07, oil got up to $1.50, end of 06, beginning of 07, somewhere in there. And if I could have sworn it hit 150, maybe it didn't quite reach there. But by the bottom in 2009, oil had been knocked all the way down to $35-40 a barrel. So from 140, let's call it 150 to 35. Okay. Over that period of time when the price of oil dropped, so it got cut by more than 65%. Okay. And that happened on a global reduction of oil demand by about 3.3%. Okay. And why? It's not that, global oil demand only dipped a tiny bit. Well, it's because you were pumping oil, right, for that. Now, and remember, there's a lot of folks out there that, due to the way they've managed their balance sheet, now this is less true today than it was back then, but because of the way they've balanced their manage, if you're a really moneyed up oil producing company and oil demand shrinks and cost starts, prices start getting low, margins start getting squeezed, you can potentially shut off some wells, right? Save some oil for better prices, things like that. If you've got a levered up balance sheet, though, those debt payments are required every single month. So you may hate selling oil at $40 a barrel or $35 a barrel, but you have to, right? Because if the shark quits swimming, he dies. And so that plays a dynamic. But looking at that you had a 08, 09, the financial crisis, you went into that with oil at $1.50. Through the heart of it, you got down to 35.40. And that was all driven by I believe it was 3.5%, slightly less than 3.5% reduction in global oil demand. So had they truly closed the Strait of Hormuz, that would have been a problem. Having said that, up until now, look, I want to caveat this with this whole Iranian situation is a perfect example of what I'm about to talk about. And what I mean by that is, I'll be honest with you. Had you asked me on Thursday or Friday, am I in favor of them bombing Iran? My answer would have been, I don't know. The reason that would have been my answer is because I don't have my eyes on the intel that they have. If Iran truly was close to having a nuclear weapon, then based on the other things I know, it doesn't sound like a bad idea to bomb their nuclear facilities in light of the other choices available. Okay? B, I do not think that bombing Iran is the beginning of World War III. And I think that anybody arguing that, if somebody's saying it could be the beginning of it, of course, you're not going to get a bit of pushback from me. Look, we have seen the pond of history be rippled by far smaller rocks than the bombing of Iran, right? And by that, Archduke Ferdinand, I would say, was a much smaller deal, right? On the surface of it, an Archduke Ferdinand situation looked incredibly benign on the face of it compared to what has been going on in Iran recently, especially given the area of the world that it's happening in, right? So I would never say it couldn't be. But I thought that take was nonsensical. And the reason why I thought it was nonsensical is, like, look at what their response to Israel was. Now, they sent some rockets and things like that, but go look at the actual damage it did. Right? So if that is what they're capable of responding to is, I guarantee you this, the Iranian regime is far more concerned about the repercussions of tangling up with us than they are Israel. And if that's their response to Israel, then I kind of think it shows you probably not a lot to be worried about. But I wasn't sure, right? We've seen too many of these things in the past result in long conflicts, regime changes. We're going to go and topple that bad regime, and democracy is going to have the sunlight it needs to grow. And that's never turned out. Again, I'd look at you and say Iran's a different scenario. Meaning Iran is not this backwater in the Middle East that some strong man was able to come in there and get under its control, right? Culturally, demographically, all that stuff being said, size-wise, just population, it's not a comp to Libya and Syria. It's very different. 60% of the underlying population is Persian. They're not, extremist. They tend to be pro-Westerners. Tehran has gay bars. Okay, now they can't advertise them publicly; they're secret. But I mean that gives you kind of an insight into it's a much more westernized culture. You're not talking about, you're not at all talking about the type of people that make up Syria or Afghanistan or even Iraq. For instance, when you looked at the two biggest subsets living in Iraq, it were Shia and Sunni Muslims. Well, the biggest subset by far living in Iran is Persian, 60%. Now, do you have Shia and Sunni in there? Yes, but they pale in comparison to the larger, chunks of the economy or of the country. And so, I think for that reason, I think you have much better chances in ending up with a positive move when it comes to regime change in Iran than many of these other Middle Eastern countries. Now, does that mean regime change as a stated goal is a guaranteed winner? No, because you don't know who's going to fill in that vacuum. Now, my suspicion, if I was a betting guy, I think that now this seems like a bold statement, but I'll throw it out there. And I'm not sure at all. I'm not even putting this in my investment thesis, but I will be surprised if we don't look back and see this right now as the beginning, at least the beginning of the end for the Ayatollah in their reign. And the reason why I say that is if it has ever been doubted, whatever credibility or capability that they thought Iran or the Iranian military had, that's been completely blown out of water. At no point have they ever been more feckless or more toothless than they are now. And as far as I'm concerned, based on what I'm seeing, this Iranian issue's over. And why do I say that? Because they responded by launching an attack on our base in Qatar. And before they did, they checked with the Qataris by default, checking with us, and basically asked if it was okay. Okay, so why are they doing that? They're doing that purely as a way to try to save face to their constituency and act like they're still fighting back against the big Goliath. But they're also making sure the Goliath realizes that it's not intentional. And they cleared it with us first. And that is one of the reasons why I think you've got to hold out hope. Because inside of Iran, they took out several members. I don't know the numbers, but we've as it's been reported, a significant amount of senior military officials inside of Iran. And if you're a high up in the Iranian military, nothing that's happened over the last 72 hours has got to be sitting very well with you, right? You don't like the fact that you've just been completely uncovered as a paper tiger. You don't like the fact that regardless of all the endless rhetoric and everything, that you had no answer to Israel or America. You hate the fact that your government is responding in fake retaliatory strikes. And to let you guys know, they told Qatar ahead of time it was coming. And by telling Qatar, they were telling us, okay, we have one of our largest, or I think it's one of our largest international bases in Qatar, right? So by telling Qatar, they were telling us. And why were they telling us? Because they didn't want it to be perceived as a legitimate threat. They shot 13 missiles. They shot down 12 of them, and one of them they let go free because it was basically flying out into the middle of nowhere in the desert. Okay, so right now, despite all the rhetoric and talk, and here's why I put it like this, guys, and I had similar thoughts about the trade deal. And this is why I hate where we're at in society today. Well, there's a lot of different reasons. But, this is the beginning of World War III. Oh, they're going to close the Straits of Hormuz. And then on the other side of it, we're going to topple the Iranian regime. We're taking over. Next, we're going to go in there with boots on the ground. You've heard all these crazy theories. The reason all of this frustrates me, and I know it's just people being people and people being stupid and all that kind of stuff, but it frustrates me because it makes things more opaque. It freaks more people out. It confuses the picture. It generally speaking, especially in our country today, anything that ramps up the heat or the rhetoric or the tension or anything like that, it's probably not constructive. It's probably not doing anybody any favors. And here's the other thing. Do I like, going back to the trade example with Trump, do I like tariffs? No, I think they're very reductive. Okay. But regardless of what Trump says, he doesn't like them either. Right. The reason Trump was talking up tariffs is, I'm convinced, because he wanted to convince the world that he was willing to do it. And the reason he wanted to convince the world he was willing to do it is because they're not going to give you their best deal unless they think you're actually serious. Right. So you may hate tariffs and you may think they're reductive. I'm convinced that everybody in the Trump administration would agree with you if you pressed them enough. But the real test of it, if this ends up with a significantly better trade deal than Japan, then putting the tariffs on was fantastic. If it doesn't, then it was a wasted effort. But I also think that, tariff you can remove at any time. So I've never bought into, tariffs are going to deep six the economy. Now, if you rolled at 50% and left them on there for a long time, absolutely it would. But it's been my contention from the very beginning. And Chase and I have gone around about this where I'm like, look, I don't believe him. I don't believe Trump. I don't think he really likes tariffs. I think he's trying to convince the world that he's willing to use them to maximize his leverage and get the best deal possible. So I think you have to apply the exact same. And look, I as a guy that on the face of it does not like the sounds of us bombing any other sovereign country, especially if they tend to be in the Middle East. And why? I mean, recent history, right? It hasn't worked out very well for us. It's been kind of expensive in a lot of ways, blood, treasure, credibility. So I don't like it on the face of it. However, if this leads to, which I think is not again, I'm not saying I think it's a probable outcome. I think that's probably too big, but I think now you might be in the 25-35% range likelihood that this could eventually lead to regime change in Iran. And you have to see the way it plays out. Like, for instance, like one of the things I was thinking about over the weekend is, what if this really does eliminate Iran's ability to make a nuclear weapon and leads to regime change in Iran? How could anybody sit there and go that dropping those bunker busting bombs on what is effectively a military installation, right? So not targeting civilians, not blowing up babies, not doing all that kind of stuff. How would you say that if it led to that conclusion, how could you say it was anything other than a raging success? And this is where we're at, unfortunately, is that, it is so much easier to critique things from the outside looking in than it is to be the man in the arena, right? And I'm not saying that to give Trump clearance, and I'm not saying that to make excuses for him. I'm just, he wants to bomb Iran. My attitude is, hope you're right. You want to do the tariff thing with China and the rest of the world. My attitude is, hope you're right. People are like, you're not against it. And I go, look, I don't have all of his information. So if I don't have all of his information, how can I sit there summarily look at him and tell him he's wrong? I can't. Okay. And more importantly, these situations by definition are outcome dependent, meaning it all depends on the way it ends up. Right? So something, is it bad what we just did, Iran, on the face of it? I don't think so. Not when you consider their threats, their posture, their behavior, and their desired goals, right? If we're taking them serious, and look, there's a lot of other countries around the world that don't align with us on a lot that would also agree to that statement. Okay, so could it be a very positive thing? Absolutely. And history is just replete with so many of these examples, right? Like when you're sitting on your couch at home, you have the ability to be idealistic and true, morally consistent, if you will.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate and actual performance may differ.
But in the real world, we deal with natural constraints. We deal with natural issues, right? We deal with things that are pretty messy, right? And oftentimes, but majority of the time, things don't play out the way you think. So it's just so exhausting to hear all of these people that are operating with this much of the information. Trump's betrayed us. Trump's exactly like we thought he was. He's the greatest president in the history of the United States. He's a war criminal. All this stuff. And you're like, look, guys, there's no way to critique these moves, in my opinion. Be like, he does the right to wage war. He didn't declare war against Iran. Yes, we bombed their facility, but that's been an ongoing issue that's been going on for a very long time. If you ask Iran if they consider being in all-out war with us right now, they'd look at you and go, boy, I sure hope not. Now, do I understand why people would say that's a declaration of war? Yes. The only reason why it's not a declaration of war is because they have no ability to counter. Right? So, but that, that's something you have to consider. The only way you could sit there and go, oh, no, it's a declaration of war. I mean, that's Trump derangement syndrome, right? That's the only way you get there. But the toughest part about it, like I said, is all of these things, including about how I just positioned these issues. I don't know that, I just don't think that there's any way to know other than to wait and see how it plays out. And so, that's why this Iran situation for me, and it's why you didn't hear me having a whole lot of hot takes, because everybody was telling you reasons why we should. Everybody was telling you reasons why we shouldn't. And I was sitting there going, I don't know how either of you are making that determination. We don't have enough information to know that for sure. It's Bibi Netanyahu pushing Trump into war and we're doing Israel's bidding. And is that possible? Absolutely. And I don't think you take that off the table. But you don't know that. You haven't seen the intel that he's seen. I saw a lot of people going, I voted for Trump. This isn't what I voted for. He's lost me now. Wait, you voted for a guy that has access to all the information and intel, and you trust your take on it without seeing a single page of that intel? If you really voted for that guy, didn't you vote for him because you trusted his decision-making or his judgment in cases like these? It's just odd to me. It's a hard one for me to wrap my head around. Right? I understand the statement of going, I don't want to get in another war. But I think that it's not really hard to make an argument that the thing that gets us the quickest to war and potentially thermonuclear war is a country like Iran getting a nuke. Now, am I making the assertion that if they developed a nuke, they'd set it off in the middle of Israel instantly, or it'd go off in Tel Aviv? No, I'm not saying that I'd know that. Nobody knows that. But I'll tell you what, I think that us bombing their nuclear facility is far less dangerous to the rest of the world than them having a nuke. So that's my take on it. But man, all of these hot takes, I just love it. I just love it. It would be like watching a poker tournament and not having, they have those cameras in the poker tournaments so you can see the hands that people hold already, right? But not having those cameras and sitting there in the middle of it, ripping this guy, Oh, what an idiot. What an idiot. He just folded there. You've got no idea what cards he's holding. You can't see the cards. How do you know he's an idiot? How do you know that how do you know that by laying down that hand, he didn't just win the whole dang thing? Meaning, had he gone in, maybe that would have taken him out of the tournament. And we may look back here in the next 6 hours and say that actually him folding that hand is the only reason he was there at the end. It's really that ridiculous. Especially when it comes to the Middle East and what a boiling pot that is. Now, am I sympathetic to the people that think Netanyahu and Israel could be pulling us into another conflict because it behooves them? Absolutely. And you got to keep your head on a swivel. But the realities of geopolitics, the realities of situations like this is that you're playing a game of probabilities. And when you're playing a game of probabilities, you cannot be that ideologically, led. You can't be that ideological, in my opinion. You've got to let things play out. So, and I'm not at all declaring this a victory either. Overall, I think regardless of what decision he made, I think history is going to be the report card. I think it will probably take multiple years for us to know. Hopefully that would assume that it's, and why do I say hopefully? Well, I mean, if the world is descended in World War III in the next 3 months, then I'm clearly wrong. And all those detractors were correct. But look, I also think that, especially as it relates to Iran, right? Bombing their nuclear facility and invading their country are two very different things. So, you have to be, anytime you're going to drop any kind of munition or fly over or get engaged on a military basis with any other sovereign country, you better have very good footing for it. But at the same time, the peanut gallery with no access to the underlying information and, listening to, Democratic politicians coming out and all of a sudden they're anti-war and you're looking at them going, walk me through Ukraine. I think the whole thing is just foolishness. And like I said, and that assessment of mine leaves open the idea that this could have been a huge blunder. Maybe it did open Pandora's box. Maybe it proves to be a really horrible decision, but truthfully, any intellectually honest person out there, I think, has to admit that you're just not going to know that over a period of time. And we didn't see all those cards. So, I went a little bit longer on that topic than we thought, but obviously it's pretty topical. It's certainly very prescient, but, I think the sell off in the price of oil is telling you that the market perceives it to be on. The other thing is also, let's be careful with the market reaction. And we've talked about this before, but we can make guesses at why this happens. I will continue to say that this is the most risk blind market I've ever seen. And when I say that, it doesn't build in the potential for negative outcomes. And I could lay down 100 different scenarios that I think prove that. It does not price everything in the way it used to. It just doesn't. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and look at January of 2020. It is the most unbelievably market blind thing I have ever seen. I go look at the end of 21, beginning of 22. The fact that people got run over in really expensive tech stocks at that time. Now later they were bailed out by AI, but that didn't exist at that point, right? So in a weird way, that even furthers my point. It didn't even see AI coming, right? But look at how people got ran over by bonds. It's just, meaning those were two. How'd you know bonds were going to get hit? Well, I mean, you had the economy growing at 5% nominal, 6% notional at that time, nominal growth. And you had inflation at 5-6% or wherever it was at that time. And the Fed says, we're going to jack rates. You didn't think that interest rate sensitive things were going to go down? So you got to listen to the market. You got to listen to what it's saying, but I don't think that there's ever been a time where you could trust the market less, because this market has proven over and over it is risk blind. It will just run smack dab into it. Now, I think part of that reason is because of how interconnected everything is. People have more reason to believe that they can get out of the way in time than they ever have. It is an anomaly historically when looking at markets that everybody's walking around with a supercomputer trading machine in their pocket and can liquidate their entire portfolio, regardless of where they are in the world, within 10 seconds, right? That's a new, so some of those things justify it. But it is clearly a risk blind market. So do I think that markets deserve the reaction that you saw out of them today? No, I think that's ridiculous. I also think the sell-off in oil is overdone. Unless you think that there is a serious slowdown in growth coming. But that being said, it's not surprising to me. And the reason it's not surprising is, look, every significant geopolitical instance for the most part over the last 15 years, the right move was to fade it. And it wasn't to fade it because these things didn't end up being problems. Although I will say most of the bad, quote unquote, bad things that have occurred over the last 15 years, although being problems and costing lives and having horrible impacts, most of those problems, virtually all of them that I can think of, never metastasized and became the full-size problem they were. Now, COVID being the one exception, but what did that prompt? It prompted the greatest wealth giveaway printing of money in the history of the world's ever seen. So bottom line is, anytime any of that geopolitical risk has been realized over the last 15 years, 20 years, it's been instantly whitewashed and sanitized with just a river, a pyroclastic flow of printed money. And so, you do that for a while in markets and you start developing this Pavlovian feedback loop where, market gets hit or people start getting a little unsettled about, something bad in the world's going on. And one or two bad days, maybe the market's only down 1.5%, but everybody's like, you gotta buy the dip, man. You gotta buy the dip. You start fading. And we talked about this last week. Of course, this will eventually, and it will lead into a trap, right? Eventually, and a really nasty one. And that's probably how this expansion will end at some point. Meaning you will rally right into a really bad event. And then all of a sudden, because of that reflexive activity, that extra rallying, you're going to be looking at, and like I said, I think eventually, now here's the thing. When I say eventually, I don't mean within the next 2 years. Eventually can be a really long time. But remember, every single time this happens, it only further reinforces, and that's what I'm saying, just eventually you're going to run into one of these. Right? Eventually, you're going to be rallying against it, sell off, fade geopolitical news, and then it's going to be the real deal. Kind of like COVID. I mean, that's effectively what the market was doing. It was just whistling past all the threats that we were getting from overseas, from China. If you guys were listening to the show back then, you remember how we were just apoplectic in January going, holy smokes, man. They just basically shut down the entire manufacturing center in China. They effectively have 750 million people on house arrest. This is the world's largest economy. And at the same time, the S&P 500 was up 13% that month alone. You're just pulling out your hair going, this is insanity. And that's what it'll look like. And then all of a sudden, right, you realize, right, and why was that such an easy market to fade, at least for us at that time? Because look, I didn't know that what was going on was going to be as bad as it was. But what I knew is that what was going on in no way, shape, or form supported markets being up 13% that month alone. And so, that's kind of, now, eventually those people that were belligerent got bailed out by the greatest wealth transfer in history. But eventually you'll be in a scenario where, the Fed's not able to come to the rescue, or, maybe there's another complication of some other kind. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. Today, a little rundown on the markets. I got a little ahead of myself talking about Iran, but let's pull this up. So SPY, S&P 500 was up right at 1%, 0.99. So finished right at 600. It's been flirting with this level. It's flirted with breakouts from this level, hasn't been able to break them since setting the year's high earlier in the year. You're only 13 points away there. So we're at 600, 602 now in after hours. It's up 0.34 in after hours for whatever reason. But probably shouldn't pay attention to that. That's probably just noise. But you're at 600, all-time high is 613. I'll just continue to say where we're at right now. Will we break out? I don't know. This is a very tough range for me. On a fundamental basis, I think it's absurd to be breaking out from this level. But, valuations have been untethered for a very long time, so that doesn't surprise me. When I see a stock like Tesla going up 8.5% today because of Robotaxi Day that everybody knew for months was happening today, and from everything I've seen, the rollout is really pathetic. You're watching things happen on a daily basis that are laughable. And guys, I hear people saying, "Oh, you're just anti-Tesla." Not at all, man. Not at all. I'm cheering for Musk. I hope he's successful. I used to not be able to stand the guy, but I appreciate a lot of the things he's done. And I've even come around on him. There are a lot of things that I thought that he was being dishonest about that it turns around. And now look, I think he's stretched the truth, certainly, and especially when it's helped him. But I don't think he's ever been purposefully misleading. And what I will mean is I think he has overstated the quickness at what's knowingly so. I think he's overstated the company's ability to bring certain things to market or get certain things online or launch certain things. But I don't think it was fraud in the sense, I don't think he's ever said they were going to do something that he didn't intend to do. Okay. So I'm not cheering for his demise at all. What I'm cheering for are rational markets. Okay. Because irrational markets create chaos. Okay. Irrational markets get people destroyed. Irrational markets can lead to economic catastrophes. And when you look at Tesla right now, being an automobile manufacturing company, when you understand how badly they are behind in the full self-driving tech, and I don't care what Elon says, I don't care what any bull out there says, go look at what's going on. They don't even have self-driving cars right now. They have to have somebody in the car with the computer, and they have to have somebody back at their station that's overwatching the computer. Why? Because they can't get the full self-driving certificates because they don't have level 5 autonomy. And it's something that we've been talking about Tesla bulls forever. You guys keep talking about full self-driving. They are way behind. They are way behind. Now, is there anybody that I want to bet against less than Musk? No. So I am not telling you to short Tesla. I'm not telling you it's going to zero. Okay? I don't ever want to be in a situation. Now, we've made a lot of money shorting his stock, but it has nothing to do with being anti-Tesla. It has to do with a valuation that makes no sense on any metric. It just doesn't. So if you're long Tesla for any reason, you better just admit to yourself rationally that you're an Elon Musk fanboy and you're never going to bet against him, because that's the only reason you can be long the stock here at this valuation. But Zach, full self-driving. Guys, what is their car business worth? It is getting obliterated. And it's not getting obliterated for political reasons. It's getting obliterated because of the competition. The margins it used to have, those are gone. They're a function of history now. The only reason those margins existed is because they could sell their cars at a premium because of perceived brand value and the fact that they had no competition for so long. That ship has sailed. Okay, so what I'm saying to you is, if you're long Tesla in size here, they better figure out full self-driving, because that is what's, in my opinion, if you look at 80 to 85% of their market cap, it's full self-driving. It's not the car business. The car business is going backwards. Their revenues are negative. Their margins have been crushed. So, and that's what's so ridiculous. Oh, it's full self-driving. It's full. Well, guys, they got a $1.1 trillion market cap. That's what you're paying for. So I don't get it, but I'm not anti-Musk at all. I'm not cheering against Musk. You just, and if you are all fired up about Tesla stock, and because that's always the way Tesla bears, oh, you're just a Tesla bear. You know, that's always the way they defend it. I just go, no, look, you're holding stocks for completely irrational, non-existent purposes. that are mathematically indefensible. Now, like I said, so you're saying short it? No, I wouldn't short it because I actually wish him luck. I want Tesla to succeed. I want Tesla to be the world's largest EV manufacturer. They're a US-based company. And I love the fact that he's disrupted the automobile company. I am cheering the guy on, but cheering him on and buying stock at a completely ridiculous price is it's not the same thing. I don't know. I don't need to go buy a $150 to $200 billion company at a $1.2 trillion valuation. That means I'm a good investor. It doesn't mean I'm for or against Musk, or not even a good investor. What it means is I'm not an insane investor. So it's just incredible to watch these businesses and watch how people are willing to suspend logic and reason to chase something that they clearly don't understand, that they don't know. And I guess this is what happens when things go unpunished for too long and idiots aren't faced to or aren't made to pay a price. But you know, we'll got to see. Housing data came out again today. Inventory levels continue to climb. I don't understand how you don't have a break in construction here pretty soon. My guess is that it's probably happening right now, which will be another pressure on the economy. Hard to know how much, right? So many of these things are fluid. There's still so much up in the air. But again, I'll go back to this fundamentals. The tough part about this is usually when there is so much conflicting data, usually when there is this many, if you just told me about the geopolitical issues going on around the world, the tariffs, all the different stuff we're trading or that we're dealing with right now, I would look at you and go, if I knew nothing else, I'd probably look at you and go, it's probably a pretty good time to buy stocks, right? What complicates this picture so much further is it's not. You're looking at one of the most expensive stock markets in history. And it's a tough one to deal with, right? So it is why we very much are still believers that you need to be globally diversified. I think there's still a lot of other great opportunities out there. Got to get Brent Johnson back on to talk about what he's seeing in South America. But boy, found a couple other companies today. The valuations out there, we found this just pristine bank in South America that's growing. It's got great management, traded on the New York Stock Exchange, paying a 14% dividend, trading at 6 times earnings, with underlying performance that is just swamping out American counterpart or, American comps. Talking about American banks. Haven't pulled the trigger on that one yet, but fascinating stuff. And we're finding that stuff all over the place. Am I going to look at you and tell you that's everything you need to be into? No. But like I've said from the very beginning, that's what I think, that's one of the big opportunities I see out there right now. Because by going back to much more of a historical norm portfolio, by having some international exposure, by not being completely buried in U.S. stocks, specifically ones that are all in the same sector, U.S. tech, I think you're injecting greater levels of diversification. So therefore, generally speaking, greater insulation against market volatility. I think that you're inserting tremendous levels of income creation into your portfolio by way of those, I think about this. Let's say you only did it with, 20 to 30% of your portfolio that you distributed into overseas companies. I'm telling you right now, if you really did your homework and you were really judicious about it, I think you could get an average yield on that portion of your international portfolio at 9%. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if the rest of your portfolio is yielding nothing, your overall portfolio is doing 3.5, right? If it's let's say if it's 25, 30% of your portfolio and that yields 9 to 10, right? Somewhere between 2.8 to 3.5% yield on the entire portfolio, which pays a lot of management fees, right? And delivers a yield that's higher than the S&P 500. And that's just with a third, right? The other thing is when you look at the valuations, I think you're inputting incredible amounts of upside. So now what's the tough part about that? Timeline. You don't know when that stuff's going to pay. And that becomes especially pernicious in a market where now this does not indicate whether the market's going one direction or the other. Nobody knows. What I will say is I have never seen a market more short-term minded. Not in my career. And I know for a fact it wasn't like that prior to me coming into this business. So, meaning nobody is a respecter of things. Even, if you start stretching out further beyond this quarter, nobody really cares. And I think you could point out again, price movement after price movement after price movement to back that up. So I still continue to believe that the opportunities are outside. Still love the gold companies. The one thing I will say is watching the markets here, I think one of two things has got to happen. I think you either break to new all-time highs, or I think you sell off again, maybe revisit the lows on the year. If you put a gun to my head right now, I'd say I'd probably reluctantly be leaning to the idea of breaking to new highs. If you do break to new highs and you can maintain that even for a week, I think I think it could be a pretty indication that things are going to get really weird, which means we got to see the way it plays out. But if you accelerate from here on the upside, it again, don't want to judge it till we see it happen, but multiple expansion in this environment would be, that would be incredible. Now, if it was any other market, I'd say you're not going to have to worry about it. You're not going to see it. I just think in this market, you can't X anything out. What people are willing to buy, the nonsense people are willing to listen to, the idiocy that they're using, and the lack of reason they're using to buy assets and trade. It's hard to wrap your head around. Or, think about this. You go back to the tech boom highs, right? Like 10 times revenue back then was seen as kind of like the pantheon of idiocy. The largest company in the S&P 500 is trading at 13 times revenue right now, Microsoft. Those who goes, well, yeah, if you look at their profits, guys, yes, I have looked at their profits, and their profits are no way close to justifying 13 times revenue, especially if you start factoring in stock-based comp and all this other kind of crap. Are they an incredible company? Yes, but that is a ludicrous valuation. So but like I said, guys, these things have been there has been a lot of, like, Tesla's valuation has never made sense. Right? I don't know. We'll have to see the way things play out. But housing data, like I said, that came out today, again, suggests inventory stacking up. It's still not a lot of really bad news, but also not a lot of really good news. And then, like I said, in that environment, you don't typically see asset prices priced to perfection the way they currently are. But nonetheless, that's where we sit. So anyway, guys, as always, you can get us on the social media, Instagram, Facebook. We're on Twitter at KYR Radio, at Pinecone Macro for Chase. If you want to see the video on YouTube, just go to YouTube, search Know Your Risk Podcast. Will pop right up. Not hard to find. But if you do that, go subscribe to us. More subscribers we get, easier it is to get interviews and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, have a wonderful evening. We will see you guys tomorrow. I'll be back with Chase in tow. Until then, have a wonderful night. You're listening to Know Your Risk Podcast. Download and subscribe at knowyourriskpodcast.com.
Investment advice cannot be given without a client service agreement. Zach Abraham is an investment advisor representative of Trek Financial, an SEC registered investment advisor. Bulwark Capital Management is a marketing name only and does not carry a separate registration.